Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are launching ourselves into, well, a piece of philosophical architecture that really did change everything. Immanuel Kant's Prolegomena.
That's short for Prolegomena zu einer jeden künftigen Metaphysik, die als Wissenschaft wird auftreten können.
Right, which is quite a mouthful. But that title is basically Kant's promise, isn't it? A guide for any future metaphysics that wants to be taken seriously as a science.
It's not just a book, it's a blueprint. I mean, for centuries before Kant, metaphysics, the branch of philosophy dealing with the ultimate nature of reality, things like God, freedom, the soul, it had been completely adrift.
It just wasn't progressing.
No, it couldn't agree on anything. He looked at fields like physics, thanks to Newton, and he saw undeniable, universally accepted certainty.
And then he looked at metaphysics.
And saw endless contradictory dogmas. As he famously put it, it floated on top like foam. Metaphysics was caught in this cycle. A philosopher would assert truths. That's dogmatism.
And the next generation would just tear them all down.
Yeah.
That's skepticism.
Exactly. So his goal wasn't to write yet another book of metaphysics, asserting his own set of truths. He was doing a preliminary investigation, a prolegomena.
To figure out, is scientific metaphysics even possible? Can we find a stable foundation for it at all?
Precisely. And to answer that, he had to first define what makes metaphysics different from all other sciences. And that brings us to the question of its sources.
Okay, because if we look at other sciences, their sources seem pretty clear. Physics, for instance, it finds its source in observation, right?
Yeah.
In things outside us.
Outer experience, yeah. And empirical psychology, that draws its data from inner experience, from observing our own thoughts and feelings.
But metaphysics aims for something bigger. It's dealing with universal necessity, absolute truths.
Right, concepts that have to apply to reality everywhere, always, not just what happens to be true for you right now.
Which means it can't be based on the senses, it can't be empirical.
That's the critical first step. Metaphysical knowledge has to be purely a priori. It has to be derived solely from pure understanding and pure reason, completely independent of what our senses tell us.
Its knowledge lies beyond experience.
Jenseits der Erfahrung. This independence from the messy facts of the world is what gives it that necessary and universal quality he's looking for.
But hold on, if its source is purely a priori knowledge we have without experience, how is that different from pure mathematics? Math is also a priori.
And that is Kant's crucial insight. He agrees they share that a priori source, but he argues that before we can even begin to tackle these huge metaphysical questions, we have to analyze the fundamental mechanism of thought itself.
How we structure and form judgments.
Yes. If we can't explain how certain expanding knowledge is possible in math and physics, which everyone agrees are real sciences, then we have absolutely no hope for metaphysics.
Okay, so let's unpack this core cognitive architecture that grounds the entire project. We're diving into part one, the essential divide. Kant starts by categorizing all possible statements or judgments based on how the predicate relates to the subject.
And he says we have judgments that are merely clarifying, and then those that are genuinely expanding our knowledge.
So the clarifying ones, he calls those analytic judgments.
Exactly, or lodernd, as the German puts it. These are judgments where the predicate is logically contained within the subject concept already.
Give us the classic example again.
All bodies are extended.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have the concept of a body, the concept of being extended or taking up space is already necessarily part of that definition.
So stating it just clarifies what you already knew. It doesn't add anything new.
Not at all. You don't need to go out and check the world to confirm it.
And the principle underpinning this is the principle of contradiction.
Absolutely. Analytic judgments are true by definition. If you say some extended body is not extended, you've just contradicted yourself. It's a logical impossibility.
So they're necessary, they're universal, but they don't move the ball forward intellectually. They just organize what we implicitly knew.
Right. We use them to clarify definitions. But if we want to learn something new about the world, we need the second type.
Synthetic judgments.
Yes. The expanding judgments, the erweiternd ones. In a synthetic judgment, the predicate adds completely new information to the subject. Information that you could not have derived from the subject concept alone.
So if I say the door is blue.
That's a synthetic judgment. The concept door doesn't necessarily contain the color blue. That color is a totally new piece of information you've added from observation.
And typically, these synthetic judgments are confirmed by experience. They're a posteriori. I know the door is blue because I look at it.
That is the standard case, and it's why empiricists like Locke and Hume focus so heavily on observation. But here is the central puzzle. the absolute linchpin of Kant's entire critical project.
The existence of synthetic a priori judgments.
Exactly. The knowledge that is both genuinely expanding, so it's synthetic, and at the same time universally necessary and independent of experience, so it's a priori.
If you can prove such a judgment exists, you have genuine, expansive, necessary knowledge that isn't dependent on your senses.
Dogmatism just claims to have this, but provides no grounding for it. Skepticism denies it exists, except as, a mere habit.
And Kant is saying, we know this knowledge must exist. We see it functioning perfectly in mathematics and physics.
So the task of the Prolegomena becomes answering this critical question: how are synthetic propositions or a priori possible?
And the path to answering that question requires him to make this massive break with philosophical tradition, starting with math.
A huge break. It had been an almost universal assumption among rationalists, thinkers like Leibniz, that mathematics was analytic.
That it was all just logical deduction.
Yes, that all geometric truths or arithmetic sums were simply logically deducible from their initial axioms through the law of contradiction alone.
And Kant comes in with this radical thesis. All mathematical judgments are synthetic.
And this is so crucial. If math were analytic, it would just be clarifying, like a bachelor is an unmarried man. But math is profoundly productive. It genuinely enlarges our understanding.
So let's really spend some time on his first example. 7 plus 5 equals 12.
Yeah.
Why isn't that analytic?
Well, when you hold the concept of 7 and the concept of 5 and you combine them in the concept of their sum 7 plus 5, that resulting concept contains the instruction to unify those two numbers.
Okay.
It contains the idea of two numbers being joined. However, the specific concept of 12, the unique magnitude designated by that numeral, is in no way logically contained within that union.
So if I just analyze the concepts of 7 and 5 and plus, I'll never logically derive the concept of 12.
Never. To reach the specific concept of 12, you have to go beyond the mere concepts themselves. You must bring in a mediating element, which Kant calls intuition and Showing.
You have to picture it somehow.
You have to present the numbers to yourself sequentially in time. You might picture 7 dots, and then add 5 more units, one after the other, to arrive at the new unified concept of 12.
So that act of counting or adding is what generates the new knowledge. It's an act of synthesis.
It's a synthesis, joining two separate concepts, 7 plus 5, and 12 through a mediating third element, the pure intuition of time.
And since that intuition is required, the judgment is synthetic. But it's also a priori, because 7 plus 5 must equal 12. For everyone, always. It doesn't depend on future experience.
Which proved that synthetic a priori knowledge wasn't some abstract impossibility. It was the engine driving the most certain sciences we possess.
And we see the same thing in geometry, right? The science of space.
Absolutely. Consider the axiom: the straight line between 2 points is the shortest. You can analyze the concept of a straight line all day long. Straightness is a quality. It describes path.
But it doesn't say anything about length.
Exactly. You won't find the concept of shortest, a quantitative measure logically contained within the concept of straight. To synthesize these, you have to bring in the pure intuition of space. You have to visualize that spatial relationship.
This all sounds incredibly dense, but the payoff is that by establishing math as synthetic a priori, Kant sets up a perfect trap for David Hume.
A perfect trap. Hume, who, as you said, jolted Kant out of his dogmatic slumber, he argued so forcefully against the possibility of necessary knowledge about the world, especially causality. He said our knowledge of cause and effect was just a long habit.
Because Hume saw causality as synthetic, it expands our knowledge, but he couldn't find an a priori source for it.
Correct. But here's Hume's crucial oversight. He just assumed mathematical axioms were analytic, that they only required the law of contradiction.
But Kant says if Hume had just recognized that 7 plus 5 equals 12 is also synthetic a priori,
he would have been forced to look for an entirely non-empirical foundation to explain that certainty in math. That necessity couldn't be explained by habit or observation.
And that recognition would have required Hume to expand his whole inquiry beyond experience itself.
Which would have rescued metaphysics, at least in principle, from his skeptical attack. Kant is basically saying, Hume, you were right that we can't observe necessity in the world, but you missed the fact that necessary expansion exists in mathematics. Let's find out where that necessity comes from, and we'll find the answer for metaphysics, too.
So the philosophical mission has now totally shifted. We're no longer debating whether metaphysics is possible. We're We're analyzing how the knowledge we already possess, math and physics, is possible.
Now that leads us right into part 2, the critical method.
So we're treating the existence of pure mathematics and pure natural science as an undeniable fact, a given. Now we use the analytic or critical method to work backward.
We map the sources of this knowledge onto the architecture of the human mind. We need to dissect the 2 cognitive faculties Kant identifies. Sensibility, which is how objects are given to us through intuition.
And understanding, which is how we process and structure those intuitions into concepts and judgments. Let's start with pure mathematics. How is it possible?
Well, we just established that the synthetic nature of mathematics requires this direct presence of objects, a construction, not just thinking about concepts. And this is the role of pure intuition.
A philosopher just analyzes the concept of triangle, but a mathematician actually draws it, constructs it.
Exactly. They construct it in pure intuition, demonstrating its properties. The puzzle remains, though. How can we have intuition, this immediate presentation of an object a priori? Intuition usually implies experience.
Because if the object itself, the thing in itself, were the source of our intuition, then our knowledge would always be based on that thing being given to us empirically.
Precisely. If we knew things as they are in themselves, the noumenon, our knowledge would be a posteriori. But we need certain knowledge before the object is given.
Which leads to the fundamental realization
That intuition can only precede the object if it consists solely of the form of sensibility.
Okay, so the form of sensibility is our subjective, pre-existing capacity to receive impressions. It's the structure or filter we carry with us that organizes all raw sensory data.
It's like the operating system of the mind. That's a great analogy. It's the framework, not the data.
And the 2 pure forms of intuition inherent to our sensibility are space and time.
Space is the form underlying all external appearances, which is the foundation of geometry.
And time is the form underlying all internal appearances, the succession of our mental states.
Which is the foundation of arithmetic, that successive addition of units, and crucially the necessary structure of motion and change.
And now the synthesis is possible, because since space and time are forms inherent to us, every sensible object that appears to us must conform to them.
The certainty of mathematical judgments, the fact that 7 plus 5 will always equal 12, is guaranteed, not because the cosmos is inherently mathematical, but because the structure of our mind ensures that anything we can experience spatially or temporally must obey these mathematical rules.
And this is Kant's famous Copernican revolution in philosophy. Instead of assuming our knowledge must conform to objects,
Kant proposes that objects must conform to our knowledge.
that reversal is everything. It shifts philosophy from chasing this external, unknowable reality to analyzing our own cognitive apparatus.
It does, but this concept that our knowledge is only certain because objects conform to the structure of our mind, it sounds dangerously close to subjective idealism.
The idea that the world exists only in our heads, like Bishop Berkeley's position.
Kant spent a lot of effort clarifying this. He accepts the existence of external objects, they are real, but he insists that we only ever know them as they appear to us, as phenomena.
We do not know them as they are in themselves, the noumenon.
Which is why he calls his position transcendental idealism or critical idealism. He's differentiating it from the dreaming idealism that denies external reality altogether.
So we have appearances, which are the objects filtered through space and time, and we have things in themselves, which are the objects before that filter, and they are entirely unknown to us.
And to really drive home the point that spatial determination is fundamentally subjective, and based on our form of intuition, he gives us the famous puzzle of the incongruent hand.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here. Kant says my right hand and my left hand are internally identical. Same size, same features, same structure, but they cannot occupy the same boundaries. They're mirror images you can't superimpose. So if the difference isn't in the concepts of hand, what makes them different?
That is the core difficulty. The pure intellect, which only deals with concepts, cannot distinguish them. If objects were known as things in themselves, the intellect would have no grounds to call them different.
And yet the difference is powerfully real. You can't put a right glove on a left hand.
So the difference must come from our way of perceiving them.
From our intuition.
Exactly. The difference between right and left is determined entirely by how these objects relate to the form of our external intuition, space. It's a determination of position and orientation within our subjective framework.
So it's not a property of the hands themselves, but a property of how we perceive them in space.
Yes. Because if space were some absolute container out there, we'd need some external reference point to explain it. But because space is our subjective frame, the difference is necessary and a priori. And it proves that our spatial knowledge legislates over appearances, not over some absolute cosmic reality.
That distinction really grounds the abstract concept of space as a subjective form. So now we can transition from the framework of receiving impressions, which is sensibility, to the framework of organizing them.
The understanding. And this gets us to how pure natural science is possible.
So pure natural science, or pure physics, deals with the necessary laws governing nature. But nature defined narrowly as the totality of objects of experience.
Right, we're not talking about things in themselves here. We are talking about appearances united under law.
And to get to experience, we need to move past simple sensory reports. We need to move beyond merely subjective perceptual judgments.
A subjective perceptual judgment is only valid for me right now. The coffee is hot to me, or I perceive the sun warming the stone. These are just associations in my mind.
They're a posteriori and lack any universal necessity.
But objective experience judgments, the kind of claims that form science, they demand necessary universal validity. Heat causes expansion. Air is elastic.
These have to be true for every observer, every time, under the same conditions.
And the understanding is the mechanism that performs this transformation. To bridge the gap between subjective perception and objective experience, the understanding has to introduce necessary non-empirical rules. These are the pure concepts a priori, which Kant calls the categories.
And these are entirely independent of perception. They force our perceptions to unite in a necessary law-like way.
Exactly. So if space and time are the forms through which the raw data is given,
the categories are the concepts through which the data is thought.
Precisely. They are the organizing principles. And Kant did this incredible feat of systematic deduction here. He derived the categories from the formal logical functions of judgment.
Okay, so since the understanding only operates through judging, the fundamental ways we logically connect concepts must, when applied to our sensory intuition, become the fundamental concepts that structure our experience.
That's the idea, and he lays it out in this systematic table.
Let's walk through that. What are the main classes?
He divides the logical functions into 4 classes. The first is quantity, which gives us the categories of unity, plurality, and totality. The second is quality, which gives us reality, negation, and limitation.
The third.
Modality. That's where we get possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, and necessity, contingency.
And the fourth group, relation. You said this is the most crucial one for scientific laws.
It is. This group generates substance and accident, cause and effect, and community or reciprocity.
Let's focus on those relational ones. Take the basic subject-predicate form, S is P, the categorical judgment. How does that give us the category of substance?
Well, logically, a categorical judgment treats S as the ultimate logical subject. It can't be a predicate of anything else. When the understanding applies this formal logical rule to our perceptions, which are always happening in time, it demands that we must seek something that persists through change.
And that creates the a priori concept of substance and accident.
We don't find persistence in external reality. We bring the principle of persistence to experience to make sense of change. Without it, we'd just see a chaotic flux of events, with nothing to anchor our observations.
The concept of substance, like the persistence of matter, is a necessary principle of experience, not some inherent quality of the thing itself.
Exactly. And the same transformative process applies to causality.
And this is the moment. This is where Kant finally provides the decisive answer to Hume. Let's re-examine that derivation.
Okay, so the logical form is the hypothetical judgment. If X, then Y. This is the logical form of ground and consequence.
And Hume was right that we can't intellectually grasp how X causes Y in a thing in itself.
He was. But Kant shows that when the understanding applies this hypothetical form to sensible intuition, to perceptions happening in time, it creates the a priori concept of cause and effect.
So we're taking a subjective temporal sequence. I see event A, and then I see event B, and we are imposing the logical form of ground and consequence onto it.
Which transforms it into an objective, necessary sequence.
The whole solution.
That is the entire solution. The concept of causality isn't some fictional habit we developed. It is a necessary principle for the possibility of experience itself. The understanding subsumes the perceived sequence under the concept of cause to turn a subjective observation.
The sun shines and then the stone warms up.
Into an objective, universally valid experience judgment. The sun's light is the cause of the stone's warmth. Without the categories, there is no objective nature to study.
This is truly revolutionary.
Yeah.
It means that when a scientist discovers a universally necessary law, they aren't discovering some hidden truth about the absolute structure of the universe.
No, they're finding a rule that their own mind, and every human mind, necessarily imposes on appearances for experience to even occur.
The revolutionary conclusion, then, is that the highest legislative power over nature rests in our understanding.
The understanding prescribes the general laws to nature. The synthetic principles a priori are nothing more than principles of possible experience. That is how pure natural science is possible, because our understanding guarantees the structure of nature as it appears to us.
But if that's true, doesn't that severely limit the possibility of ever discovering laws or concepts that exist outside our own cognitive architecture?
That is the ultimate implication, and it's what makes Kant's limits so strict. Our knowledge of necessity applies only to appearances. If there were phenomena that did not fit into space, time, and the categories, if we encountered a four-dimensional object that defied our spatial intuition.
We would either try to cram it into our three-dimensional framework, or it would just be fundamentally unintelligible to us.
Right. The certainty of science is bought at the cost of limiting its domain to the phenomenal world.
And the moment we try to use those same principles, space, time, substance, causality, outside the boundaries of possible experience, that's when we get into trouble.
Yes. That's when we transition from the modest, necessary work of the understanding to the overreaching and often tragic demands of pure reason. And that's our final section.
So the understanding is content to operate within the realm of appearances, creating objective experience. But the human mind, driven by pure reason, naturally seeks something more.
The understanding looks for conditions. Reason demands the unconditioned. It wants the complete, absolute totality of the series of conditions.
And when reason pursues this completeness beyond possible experience, it's using concepts transcendently.
And this pursuit leads to the creation of the ideas of pure reason concepts like the soul, the world, and God. These are not concepts of objects we can experience, but they are necessary concepts that guide our search for completeness.
So they're regulatory, not constitutive.
Exactly. They regulate our inquiry, they tell us where to look, but they can't constitute any knowledge of objects. And when we mistake this subjective regulatory demand for an objective reality, we fall into an unavoidable dialectical illusion, a shine.
Okay, let's start with the first of these ideas, the psychological idea. The soul.
Derived from the categorical syllogism. Reason seeks the absolute, simple, permanent subject that underlies all of our possible internal thoughts and experiences.
And we project this idea onto our internal self-consciousness, the thinking I.
We feel the unity of ourself, the continuity of our thoughts, and we mistakenly conclude that this must be the intuition of an absolute, simple, persistent spiritual substance, the soul.
But Kant says the I is merely the designation of the subject of inner sense. It's the necessary logical starting point for every thought, I think. But it is not an experienced object.
We have no intuition of it as a simple, enduring substance. And this error leads to the paralogisms of pure reason, all those philosophical attempts to prove things like the immortality or simplicity of the soul.
Which are fruitless.
They're fruitless because the concept of substance is only legitimately used to organize appearances within possible experience. To apply it outside that boundary, beyond death, renders it empty of meaning.
So the Prolegomena doesn't deny the existence of the soul. It just denies our capacity to know or prove its nature using our cognitive structures.
Right. And this brings us to the cosmological ideas, the antinomies.
This is where reason applies its demand for completeness to the external, sensible world, the cosmos.
And this is where we hit the antinomies, these four pairs of equally demonstrable, contradictory statements about the universe. This is the decisive experiment that demonstrates the illusion of reason.
Okay, let's list the four conflicts that arise.
First, finite versus infinite. Is the world limited in size and duration, the thesis, or is it infinite in space and time, the antithesis?
Second,
Simple versus compound. Does everything consist of indivisible, simple parts, or is everything infinitely complex and divisible?
the third one is huge. Freedom versus nature.
Right. Does causality exist through freedom, an unconditioned beginning of a series of events, or does everything happen only according to the necessary laws of nature?
And finally, necessary versus contingent.
Does an absolutely necessary being exist as the ultimate cause in the world series, or is everything in the world just contingent and accidental?
The genius of Kant here is realizing that the ability to prove both sides with equal logical rigor doesn't mean the universe is contradictory.
It means the question itself is based on a false premise.
And that premise is that appearances, the sensible world, are things in themselves.
That is the critical resolution. And he resolves the mathematical antinomies, the first two, by showing that both the thesis and the antithesis are false.
How so?
Well, the question, is the world finite or infinite in space, assumes the world is a self-subsisting thing, a noumenon. But the world is just an aggregate of appearances in our experience.
And we can never complete the task of experiencing an infinite world.
Nor can we ever empirically experience a world bounded by empty space. Since both answers are transcendent and lead to logical impossibility, the question itself is nonsensical. We have to reject the underlying idea that the totality of phenomena is some absolute boundary-defined thing.
Okay, but the dynamic antinomies, 3 and 4, concerning causality and necessity, are resolved differently.
They are. Here, Kant shows that both the thesis and the antithesis can be true as long as we apply them to different realms.
And this has a massive philosophical payoff, especially with the third antinomy, freedom versus natural necessity.
Yes. The antithesis states that everything in the sensible world occurs according to necessary laws of nature, a doctrine of universal determinism.
Which is absolutely true for the world of phenomena.
Yeah.
The world of appearances organized by the category of causality. Science requires this certainty.
It does. But the thesis demands that there must be causes through freedom, a spontaneous starting point for a series of events. Otherwise, morality and responsibility are illusions.
So how can both be true?
Kant resolves this by saying, look, if the acting subject, you, the learner, is regarded strictly as a phenomenon, an object in the sensible world, then every action is necessarily determined by prior conditions in time, like falling dominoes.
The scientist is correct. You are subject to the laws of nature.
But if we regard that same subject as a noumenon, a thinking agent considered as a thing in itself, outside of the strict temporal constraints of appearance, then there is a possible space for freedom.
The free act, the intelligible cause, happens outside the time series and is the ground for the phenomenal act, the sensible effect that we then observe in time.
Exactly. So the act of freedom is necessary for morality, but it does not interfere with the natural determinism required by science. The two realms, the phenomenal and the noumenal, are mutually consistent because they don't refer to the same object in the same respect.
So he saves science, with its universal necessity in the phenomenal world, while also saving moral responsibility, or freedom, in the noumenal world.
This is the central, practical triumph of the Prolegomena. The critique restricts knowledge to appearances, but by doing so, it reveals the necessary limits of the understanding, and it secures a necessary, albeit unknowable, space for pure reason's demands, freedom, immortality, and God.
So they can be considered rationally possible as objects of practical faith, even if they can't be objects of theoretical knowledge.
Which means metaphysics is not a science of determining the unconditioned, but a science of establishing the boundaries of human reason and understanding where the illusion of transcendent knowledge comes from.
So let's recap this critical path.
We started by recognizing the failure of metaphysics, caught between dogmatism and skepticism. Kant's path provided the solution.
And we successfully established how synthetic knowledge a priori is possible. First, through the subjective necessary conditions of our sensibility, space, and time, which make pure mathematics universally valid, but only for appearances.
And second, through the categories of the understanding. These are the pure concepts, like causality and substance, that transform subjective perception into objective, universally necessary experience, and that guarantees the structure of pure natural science.
The ultimate profound takeaway is that this critical idealism, this limit setting, is what guarantees the certainty of science. We know the necessary laws of nature precisely because our understanding legislates those laws to nature.
Ensuring that the appearances we encounter must conform to our cognitive structure, the general laws of the cosmos, the necessity of causation, the persistence of substance, these don't flow from external observation. They flow from the necessary conditions of possible experience in us.
So any future scientific metaphysics must accept that its only legitimate subject is the world as experience, the phenomenal world. Its concepts can't be used to determine the nature of things in themselves.
And that sets the stage for philosophy forever after. Kant basically established that the core job of the metaphysician is not to assert truths about God or the soul, but to rigorously study the architecture of the human mind itself.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. Kant demonstrated that the grandest conflicts in philosophy, the antinomies, arise from a single compelling error. treating phenomena, the world as it appears to us, as if they were things in themselves.
If this transcendental illusion is the most natural error of pure reason, consider concepts in modern physics today.
When cosmologists discuss the absolute initial state of the universe, or the ultimate boundary conditions of space-time, are we still, in some way, mistaking a necessary subjective demand for absolute completeness, the demand of pure reason, for an objective reality that lies outside the limits of possible human experience?
The quest for the unconditioned is inescapable, but Kant teaches us the wisdom of knowing when our maps run out.
We'll see you for the next deep dive.